These Greeks are accustomed to wage war amongst each other in the most senseless way. For as soon as they declare it, they seek out the most level ground and they go down there to do battle. As a consequence, even the winner leaves with extreme losses. Since they all speak Greek, they should rather negotiate rather than fight.
These words belong to Mardonios, the general in charge of the last offensive against the Greek city-states during the end of the Persian War. And however adorned they might have been by the historian who recorded them, what astounded the Persian noble was indeed unique in the whole of the ancient world. It was the way of the Phalanx, a method of war that first developed during the 7th and 6th centuries BC and gave the Greeks dominion over the Mediterranean, while twice repelling the most powerful empire of its time, the Persian Empire. It was a way that focused almost exclusively on the single, straight, frontal attack with its short, brutal and devastating outcome. It's what historian Victor Hansen called the Western way of war, a way of fighting that focused on a phrase that repeats throughout his book, the decisive battle. Sometime during the end of the 8th century, Greeks began to equip themselves with body armor, a round shield and a short spear, choosing to fight close range rather than shoot arrows and slings like the armies of Asia did almost until the 19th century, in fact. On his left arm, this new soldier would carry a round shield about 3 feet in diameter. It was called the oplon, from which his name, the hoplite, derived. The key to his success, as the Spartan general Brasidas reminded his men just before battle, was to always maintain formation, and history would show that as long as they did, no foreign army, despite its numerical advantage, was ever able to withstand the charge of the Greek phalanx. This superiority, however, came at a terrible cost, one that took its toll not only on the body, but on the soul. Imagine the Greek soldier just before battle. First, his helmet, the Corinthian, enclosing his entire head in a private world of darkness as he waits under a Greek sun that pours over like rain of hot tar. Ghostly whisper rippling through the ranks, rumors of the enemy, their numbers, their reputation, what they did to the soldiers that faced them last. The time approaches, and a sudden silence takes over, one that is louder than cries of war, as he is left to contemplate the meaning of his existence until the call to charge, moving forward, dust rising, blinding him, arms brushing on breastplates, iron touching bronze, creating a rising sound that grows louder and merges with the snorting of horses, each line thrusting the other in front of them to keep moving as the enemy approaches. There are reasons to believe that while most armies that fought face to face broke their charge at the last minute, the Greeks, and perhaps the Greeks alone, literally smashed into the enemy's lines as the unstoppable force of one phalanx ran into the immovable object of the other, crashing, rippling back through the lines, the sounds and vibrations. First, the dull thud of iron against wood as spears try to pierce through the enemy shields. Then, the metal clangs against the armor's bronze, the groans and cries of pain, always pushing forward, packed together like a single, spiked animal fighting for its life, desperately trying to move even by an inch, each line pushing the other in front, throwing itself to the enemy harder and harder, trying to break open a tear, confusion mixing with dust, sweat and blood until... Why did the Greeks fight in this way? Considering that for most of their history, the Greeks lived in a state of perpetual war, surprisingly little is known about the technical details of that phalanx. Despite the numerous references made by ancient authors, nothing exists by way of an instruction manual, one that could give us a complete picture of how these references were put together in practice. Looking at a modern recreation of a Greek hoplite may leave a viewer in a position similar to that of Mardonius. Why the Greeks fought in that clumsy manner, as most of the technology used appears rather absurd. The armor or panoply was heavy and almost unbearably hot, the least likely of candidates for waging war in the Mediterranean during the summer months. The metal helmet, the Corinthian, restricted both vision and hearing, hampering communication between soldiers, making real-time maneuvers that are based on voiced commands almost impossible. The shield, the oplon, was big and heavy, rendering the entire left arm almost immobile and pinned to the chest. Ancient playwrights may have mocked the youth of their time for being unable to carry their shield properly, but modern experiments using recreated armor show that holding it up to the chest can be very challenging even for athletic college students. In contrast to the Greek phalanx, the bulk of the Persian army was lightly armored and used weapons such as javelins and slings. When these Persians charged, they did in small groups and often in disorganized manner, leaving their cavalry responsible for ensuring the victory. The Greeks knew very well how effective these Persian techniques could be when used correctly, and even the Spartans were said to have once fled from an onslaught of slingers. And yet, they continued to view the sling as a weapon appropriate only for slaves. Tactically, the Persians excelled in the arts of ambush and feint retreats, but the Greeks, burdened by the weight of their armor and shield, refrained from using them. Given all this, it is only natural to assume that the phalanx must have offered a significant advantage when deployed correctly. And it did. We mentioned earlier the superiority of the phalanx when confronted with the armies of Asia. But there is one crucial detail that we left out. The phalanx was never designed to fight against these armies, as it was developed centuries before the Greeks could even imagine themselves in wars against Persia, and during a time when their main enemy was other Greeks who used the exact same weapons and technology. Historian Victor Hansen has a surprising answer. The Greeks, he says, did not have to fight in a phalanx. They chose to, and they did so because this was the way that was most compatible with the rest of their culture. But how can the highly sophisticated city-states that produce much of Western culture have anything to do with the brutal and Greek way of war? How did someone like Socrates choose to fight in this manner? Well, behind our confusion might be our inability to imagine all the ways the Greeks chose not to fight, the ways of tactical maneuvers and feint retreats that actually prolong the suffering of war, as each army tries to outsmart the other. Or imagine the ways of the cavalry that always requires an upper class of rich nobles in order to maintain it, separating the poor soldiers who make the sacrifice from the rich ones who score the victory. Ways, in other words, that were against the Greek ideals of the city-state. Within these lines of iron and bronze, and much like Napoleon's famous columns, strong bonds of friendship were formed between the soldiers, bonds that paralleled those that kept their city's political power in the hands of its citizens, so that the phalanx can be seen as the military version of democracy. What Hansen believes is that the Greeks chose the phalanx not because they loved the gore of battle, but precisely because they understood its nightmares and developed a system to make it a brief nightmare and an honorable one. Thousands of years later, the phalanx is only a memory, but its creeds and ideals still echo in the modern armies of Western nations. During the Vietnam War, a huge American army that was organized mostly along Western lines failed time and again to draw the North Vietnamese into the decisive battle that they wanted. And while we instinctively understand that the methods of hide and seek adopted by the Viet Cong can yield a terrible advantage, and that defending armies have every right, a duty even, to use them, there is still something left in our Western psyches that always feels a certain disappointment, a disgust even for those armies that do anything else but stand and fight. Because when Chesterton said that to use surrender as a weapon is the worst spirit of the East, he reminded us that, along with the rest of their culture, the Greeks left the West with a notion that battle, fought in any other way than direct combat, simply lacks good taste.